In a Peanuts cartoon, you have Lucy that has set up a booth that has the title Psychiatric Help. So Charlie Brown, of course, comes to Lucy to ask for some advice, and Lucy says that in order for him to get better, she would have to identify what it is that he has and what is his greatest fear. So she says to him, perhaps you are afraid of responsibility. To which Charlie says, no, that's not it. So then she says, maybe you are afraid of cats. To which Charlie says, no, I'm not afraid of cats, so that can be it. And then she kept on saying, and she says, well, then maybe you have a fear of going up a staircase and falling. And he says, no, that's not it. And then she begins to enumerate all these phobias, and Charlie Brown would say no to all of them. At the end, Lucy, frustrated, says, well, maybe what you have is pantophobia, which means you're afraid of everything. And Charlie Brown says to her, that's it. I am afraid of everything. And I think that many times we feel like Charlie Brown, we may be afraid of everything. Sometimes we're even afraid of our own shadow. There are times in our lives when we are afraid of ourselves, afraid of other people. We are afraid of our past and how that may come back to haunt us. We may be afraid of our present and whatever situation we may be living right now. We're certainly afraid of the future. The uncertainty, the not knowing what the future has for us in store. In these days of COVID-19, perhaps we are afraid of getting sick, afraid of catching the virus, not knowing how badly we will get sick, and not knowing if we are going to survive it. Fear is part of the human condition. All of us experience fear, no matter how old, how young, what gender we are. All of us experience fear. To be alive is to experience some type of fear. Obviously, there are periods in life where we experience more fear than others, but all of us experience fear in life. And we see that clearly in today's gospel. The disciples were not free from fear. In fact, in this short gospel passage that we just read, we find the disciples afraid at different levels. First of all, they were experienced fishermen, and surely this was not the first time that they experienced a storm in the Lake of Galilee. They grew up right there, right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, so they knew that this storm was bad. They knew that their boat was little. They knew that they could be shipwrecked. They knew that they could die. They were terrified. Then Jesus comes walking on the sea, and the one who's coming to bring them comfort, the one who can take away their fear, now we hear that they are terrified. They think that he is a ghost. They are afraid. They cry out in fear. Then when Peter shows his courage and he begins to walk on the water as he experiences the violence of the storm, and as he takes his eyes off of Jesus, Peter also becomes afraid and begins to sink. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." And the Lord saves him. This short passage is full of symbols, is full of allegorical meanings. Let's explore some of the symbolic things that we find in today's short gospel passage. Number one, we have the sea. The sea is a symbol. Ever since antiquity, the ocean, the sea, was seen as a symbol of chaos and disorder. The disciples in the boat are meant to represent the church. The boat, the bark of Peter, the bark of the church, the boat of the church that is seen here in the middle of a storm, a terrible, violent storm in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, which is called the Sea of Galilee. It's a big lake, but it's called the Sea of Galilee. And that is meant, the forces of the wind and the forces of the storm are meant to represent the forces of darkness that lash out against the church. All throughout the entire history of the church, we see the forces of darkness, the forces of the enemy lashing out against the church. And we are the disciples in the middle of a storm. Many times we feel like them. We feel that we are surrounded by violence, by sin, by illness, by death, by so many terrible, evil things. No wonder we feel afraid, we feel confused. We may feel a little lost, adrift in the middle of this ocean, which is the world. Then we have another symbol, which is the watches of the night. The Romans would divide the night from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. into 4 different watches. And we hear that Jesus comes walking on the sea during the 4th watch of the night. That is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. when it is darkest. So if the sea is meant to represent the world in chaos and disorder, the watches represent time. The 4th watch of the night is meant to represent the end of times. And the church has said that ever since Jesus ascended into heaven, we have been living in the end of times. It is now the hour when it is darkest. And as we experience the world, this day, we may wonder, does it get darker than this? We're living in the worst health crisis in a century. We are in the middle of a terrible economic crisis, as seen by the reports of the last 4th quarter, the worst in our nation's history. We are still in the middle of much social unrest. We may wonder, does it get darker than this? And we need to be reminded today that it is when it is darkest. It is when Jesus comes walking on the sea. It is when Jesus comes to our rescue, but the key here is to be able to recognize his presence. The tricky part is to know that Jesus is present. The disciples didn't recognize him. They thought he was a ghost. They were terrified. This is when Jesus speaks to them words of comfort. He says to them, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. It is I." This is the key to understanding today's gospel. In Greek, "it is I" reads ego eimi. And when we look at the scriptures, when we look at the Old Testament translated into Greek, when God speaks from the burning bush to Moses, and he reveals himself as the great I am who I am Yahweh, he says. When you look at the Greek translation of that, it says, ego eimi, the exact same words that Jesus uses in today's gospel. Jesus is revealing himself to the disciples here as the great I am, as Yahweh. Several times in the scriptures, in the Psalms, we hear about God walking on the water, God walking on the ocean. With God by our side, we have nothing to be afraid. So, my friends, what are you most afraid of? Think about that for a second. What are you afraid of? Illness? Failure? Inadequacy? Death? Economic insecurity? Losing everything? What are you most afraid of? Rejection? Perhaps the fear that all of us have deep, deep down in our hearts is that God is not there. Our faith is weak sometimes. We get afraid that God may not see our problems, that God doesn't care, or perhaps that there is no God. The greatest fear of the ancient peoples, the pagan people, was the fear that their gods would fall asleep. This is why Israel takes great comfort in saying that their God, Yahweh, neither sleeps nor slumbers. This is why Jesus can say, "Take courage. I am who I am. It is I. Do not be afraid." This reminds me of a story that perhaps we have heard before, but it's worth repeating and hearing once again. The story of a boy who was inside a house that was burning. When the father discovers that the house is burning, he rushes to the house, and by the time the father gets there, the son is on top of the roof. And the father knows that the only way to save the son is for the son to jump. But from the son's perspective, all he can see is chaos, flames, fire, smoke, blackness. And the father says, "Son, you must jump. I am here to catch you." And the son says, "Daddy, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid I can't see you." To which the father replies, "I know, son, I know you can't see me, but trust me, I can see you." And this is the message of today's gospel. God can see us. God sees our problems. God cares about us. When things are dark, when nothing makes sense, when we feel ourselves inside a tunnel and we don't see the light at the end, just know that God is present when it is darkest. Jesus comes to us walking on the water. Let's recognize His presence. Belief in God does not guarantee that we're not going to have storms in our life. But belief in God does guarantee that we will have His presence, that He will be by our side, that He will not abandon us, that He's not indifferent to us. So listen to the words of Jesus one more time. Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Amen.